on. And obviously there's so many issues with misinformation and active disinformation on social media that I think it's quite important that journalists have a duty to that and kind of verify the information that they see and try to be as upfront as possible about how they find that and just be helpful to the public in terms of where they can then find that information themselves. You know, say there's an event that the newspaper you're interning for has coming up, maybe just go up to the editor's desk and say, oh, I know this event is coming up later this week. Do you already have someone covering that? If not, would you like me to do it? First full-time journalism role was going to be getting a lobby pass and working out of Parliament. So I feel incredibly lucky and privileged to be able to do that and to be able to meet so many interesting people, so many influential people every day. I think obviously it comes with its ups and downs. Like everyone knows that Parliament can be quite.
Welcome to How to Be a Journalist, a podcast by News Associates. I'm Plamdi Mabungu, and thank you very much for tuning in. I'm a recent university graduate, and I work at News Associates. I'm early in my career, and I need the wisdom from more experienced journalists. So to solve this problem, in every episode, I will dive into conversations with some of the most dedicated and talented journalists from all corners of our industry, asking questions about their careers, successes, and giving you a different view of the person behind the byline. Whether you're an aspiring journalist, a seasoned figure in the newsroom, or just interested in knowing what happens behind the scenes, you're in the right place.
Today's guest is PoliticsHome political reporter Zoe Crowther. Before starting a number of different roles at PoliticsHome, Zoe studied a history BA at the University of Newcastle, before gaining a further master's in history at the University of Bristol. During her time at university, she was very active within student media, working as news editor at Newcastle and joining Epigram during her MA in Bristol. She trained at News Associates on the part-time course, whilst working here as editorial development coordinator. I could probably introduce Zoe forever, but let's hear from Zoe herself. Welcome to the How to Be a Journalist podcast. How are you doing today, Zoe?
Hello, yes, I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. I think this one was very much like a podcast episode that was requested by like a lot of my colleagues here. If we could get Zoe onto the podcast in any sort of fashion, that would be fantastic. And luckily, we have worked that out today. So this is very much the first time that I've spoken to someone that has worked in the associates marketing and admission teams. So, and for anyone that doesn't know, that is a team that I work in. So my first question for you, Zoe, is how did you come across the associates and start working here for a year before getting into part-time?
Yeah, so I suppose when I finished my master's in history, by that point I'd kind of decided I wanted to be in journalism in some form or another. I just didn't necessarily know what kind of journalism I wanted to do. So then I was back home in Nottingham, searching endlessly for journalism jobs, everything from journalism researcher jobs to social media jobs, trying to join some of the grad schemes as well. And I eventually realized that getting some kind of journalism qualification was probably going to be quite useful, because I'm sure most people who are journalists have experienced this. When you're sending off endless applications and hearing nothing back, you start to have to think about other routes that you can take and what you need to do to start getting a bit further. So then I came across News Associates, firstly as a journalism school where you could get the qualification, but then also at the time they had an opening for a editorial development assistant role. And I thought it would just be a really good in to kind of get to learn more about the industry, get my first job in London and move down to London. And at that point, I was really open to just exploring different routes, like maybe going into marketing and social media more broadly, maybe going into journalism further down the line. So I was kind of just keeping those avenues open, really, and saw News Associates as a way to do that. It did at the time clash with the first lockdown. So I ended up starting later than initially intended. So it was a long journey, kind of from initially looking at those jobs to eventually starting in, I think it was September 2020.
Yeah. So like, how did your experience of working at News Associates almost prepare you for the job that you have now?
I suppose I was lucky in that I had the perspective of like two perspectives really, because I was working there and gaining skills in social media and marketing and writing content for the News Associates website as well. And also sometimes writing content for other websites like Journal Resources, for example. But I was also learning about how to be a journalist from the tutors sitting next to them just in the newsroom and News Associates, and then also getting to do the course. So going through the course just like every other trainee got to do. So I think because I had both of those perspectives as a staff member and also as a trainee, it really meant I was able to just immerse myself in journalism really for the 2 years that I was there. And I actually think so much can be said for just learning from your colleagues. And I'm sure you know as well at News Associates, all of the tutors will have their different interests and different areas that they've either worked in before or continue to work in alongside doing their tutoring work. And that was invaluable because at the time I didn't know what kind of journalism I wanted to do. So having that broad range of expertise and voices to speak to every day was really, really great and really inspired me to think about what I wanted from a journalism career.
Yeah. Okay. So like a little bit earlier as well, you said that you made like that work job and associate with your first one in London. Was there any sort of reason why that you decided to make that jump from Nottingham to London? Because obviously it's a well traversed path here, but like was it to be like in and amongst journalism or yeah, what was your reason?
Yeah, I think I'd always been quite stubborn before that I didn't want to move to London. So going to a northern uni in Newcastle, then moving to Bristol. And I did apply for a couple of journalism roles in Bristol because I would have quite liked to have stayed there for longer. But I think really in the UK, there are two major hubs for journalism, and that's London and Manchester. And I think Manchester's got quite a lot more broadcast journalism going on in Salford and Media City. So particularly for print journalism and especially for political journalism, London is kind of the place to be. But that's not to say you can't have plenty of journalism opportunity elsewhere in the UK. But for me, a lot of my friends, either from school in Nottingham or from Newcastle or Bristol unis, had moved to London by that point. So it was also just a personal thing of wanting to be where a lot of people in their 20s are moving to for work. And yeah, I think what's really exciting about London is that you do, obviously there's just so many people here and you're never really done exploring the city. And even now, having worked as a journalist for a couple of years, I can kind of go to journalism networking events in London. There's going to be people from all over the UK that will come to London for those events. So if you want to be in the middle of it, particularly when you're young and starting out, it is obviously a great place for that.
Yeah. And so when I was researching, there was like when you started your association with these associates, you didn't straight get into like studying the NCTJ. So when did you make that decision that you're like, okay, I need to get NCTJ training to further your career?
It was something we discussed quite early on when I was applying for the job at News Associates. So it was something I was thinking about the whole time. But I suppose kind of working there for a year before starting the course, I was able to kind of focus on the job first, get to grips with that. And it was obviously during the pandemic as well. So it was quite a challenging time in terms of starting a new role, not being able to meet your colleagues as much as you might have done otherwise. So kind of having that year to just settle in was quite nice because anyone will tell you if they're doing the part-time NCJ course, especially if they're doing the full-time one, it's quite intense. So kind of doing a new job at the same time as doing the NCTJ would be quite a lot to take on. And I know a lot of people on my part-time course kind of had job changes while they were studying, for example, and found that really challenging. So I think looking back, I'm quite glad that I had that time. And it also meant that by the time that I'd started the course, I'd already had a year to kind of learn from the people around me and learn from my colleagues. So I was going into the course quite strong already, rather than going in completely blind and not really knowing anything.
Yeah. Okay. And so can I ask you about your time? Yeah, a bit more about time design course, but like the placements that you went on, because it seems like from the outside looking in, it went on quite a few, and those placements were almost like pivotal to your career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really, really lucky to be able to get a week of placement at the Sunday Times, kind of towards the end of my NCTJ course, which News Associates were really helpful in helping me set that up, because they have like a partnership with the Times that they usually work on every year. So I was able to do that, which was really, really valuable. And I think by that time, because I'd spent so much time learning from the tutors as to how to make the most of those opportunities, I really kind of prepared before arriving at the Sunday Times and had a ridiculously long document of ideas so that I could pitch it to the editor when I arrived. And even though none of them actually made it into the print paper in the end, it didn't really matter, because as long as you've pitched the ideas, worked on stuff, showed that you're really enthusiastic, it can really kind of help you onto the next place. And then the week after the Sunday Times one, I did a week freelancing with PoliticsHome and the House magazine, which are kind of sister publications. And that was really great. I feel like I didn't even go into that one maybe as prepared as I was for the Sunday Times one, but still just kind of tried to put my all into it, and then impress the editor, and then was invited to come back for freelance shifts kind of throughout that summer. So I went and covered by-election with them. I went and kind of did a bit of coverage of like local elections at the time. And then essentially that led to where I am today, because then a couple of months down the line, they had an opening for a social media journalist at PoliticsHome, and the editor got in touch with me and said that they had this opening, so would I like to apply? So it was very much a direct impact from having those placements to then being able to get a full-time job. And the Sunday Times one, even though it didn't lead to a full-time job at the Times, was still really helpful, because I was able to get commendations from the editors at the Sunday Times. I was able to use that in my application for PoliticsHome as well. So it all kind of fed into each other.
Yeah. So do you have any like sort of tips like for helping yourself stand out whilst in placement? Because obviously you only have like 1 week or 2 weeks to really, put yourself in the mind of an editor. So do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, I think firstly, doing some prep beforehand and arriving with ideas. Don't be afraid of getting those ideas rejected. Plenty of mine were turned down. They liked some of them, they didn't like others. But the most important thing is that you've got those ideas to show that you have the enthusiasm for what you're doing there and why you're there. And part of that is, and to be honest, I'd done quite a lot of work experience in totally different areas. So I'd done some work experience in marketing and publishing and things like that throughout uni. And I learned at those early work experience placements as a student that you have to be quite bold in, I guess, making your presence known when you're on placement, because sometimes when you're an intern, you can feel like a bit of a spare part. You can be kind of seated in the corner of the office. The editors will be really busy, especially in journalism. So you might kind of find yourself hours at a time without having anything to do, and not really knowing where to go from there. So either you need to then essentially go up to the manager's desk and say, oh, look, I'm not really doing anything at the moment, so is there anything at all I can help with? And that could be the most boring spreadsheet admin task, but just say yes to everything and just do it and just show that you're enthusiastic. And then if they don't really have anything for you to do, sit down and think of things that might be helpful, and whether that's pitching some ideas as a journalist or whether it's just tasks that you think might be helpful, think of what might be coming up for that week. Say there's an event that the newspaper you're interning for has coming up. Maybe just go up to the editor's desk and say, oh, I know this event is coming up later this week. Do you already have someone covering that? If not, would you like me to do it? So just think about ways to be proactive, because otherwise you're risking basically being sat there for a week and not really doing much, because you're not kind of putting your hand up actively and saying, I'm here, give me a role.
Yeah. And because obviously, like, that's the reason why I asked you that question, is to get an answer like that, because people almost think like as soon as you get that placement, there isn't like more work to be done to like really, show yourself and try and get that offer like on the other side of it as well. But could I ask, like, if you are, let's say, a person that isn't the most like outspoken person, but you have these opinions and you feel, quite passionately about them, and you have stories that you want to pitch, to editors or whatever team you are working with. Do you have any tips with those sorts of people as well that could try and make their voice heard in a news role that maybe doesn't suit them?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that can be really challenging for a number of reasons, whether people come from different backgrounds or, they've never had that kind of work experience before. So they're going into it completely new. And that's really scary. Like I've had it before. I remember at the Sunday Times, my heart was pounding when I went over to the editor's desk to pitch my ideas because I was terrified of what she might say. And while I'd say I'm probably not shy, I've definitely had that fear and kind of had to overcome it to an extent. So I think the most important thing is that you don't have to change your personality or kind of put on this huge kind of false sense of confidence. Like you can still do it in a way that's kind of slightly quiet or like unassuming. Like you don't have to be a big personality in the room. Like you don't have to go into the news conference on your first day on an internship and like interrupt people and speak over people. Like you can just send an email or you can just kind of message someone who you're on the work experience with and say, sorry to interrupt, but can I just take 5 minutes out of your day, please? Like you can just go about it in a very polite way. And I think sometimes there's an idea that all journalists have to be these really kind of brash, loud personalities, and that's just not the case. Actually, many journalists are quite introverted and quite shy, and especially depending on the type of journalism you want to go into, you don't have to have that kind of personality to make it. It's more just about finding your own way of getting a bit of an in. And if your in is the fact that you just quietly sit there and you get on with the job and you deliver it, that's really valuable. And a lot of editors really appreciate that.
So, all right, thanks for that answer, Zoe. After you've already spoken a little bit about current and PoliticsHome and working as a social media journalist there. So when you were in that role, what was your day to day and what did it look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche in journalism, but every day was definitely different. So it would kind of depend on what cycle of parliament we were in. So I think when I kind of started at PoliticsHome, it was party conference season. So at that point, you're doing a lot of going to different cities around the country, basically, and you're meeting a lot of people. So going to a lot of events, writing up those events, going for coffees, going to drinks. So a lot of socializing. But then when you're back in Parliament, it's still so a lot of that. But generally each day would start out with a meeting where the reporters will pitch ideas. When I started off as social media journalist, I was doing less of that. But if I did have an idea to pitch, I would pitch it in the meeting. And then I would spend some time scheduling social media for the day. At that point, I was making TikTok videos. So often some of my day would be doing that and kind of thinking of other social media content. And then I'd also be reaching out to MPs and just people in politics for coffees and lunches, having those conversations and working on stories. And while at PoliticsHome, we don't do loads of live news coverage compared to other places, but we still would do it for kind of big events. Say the Prime Minister was making a speech, obviously general election being announced, big things like that. So each week there's a fair amount of breaking news coverage to do as well. So not an easy answer exactly, but every day would be a little bit different. And particularly when I was doing the social media role, some days I'd be doing more social media, other days I would be doing more reporting. It would just depend on where the resourcing would be needed for that day.
Yeah. So, okay, then my next one will be a social media question next. You're obviously able to do to a high quality, build your own like personal brand on like platforms like Threads Blue Sky, TikTok, even X as well, all of those different platforms. How do you like adapt your journalism for them to work for all of these different platforms?
It's always an ongoing challenge because also platforms are always changing. What you would put on TikTok like 4 years ago when people started using it is probably quite different to what people might put out now. So you have to constantly be adapting to not only what the day-to-day trends are and how to use those, but also just the general mood of a platform and what people are looking for on the content on there. So generally, I think, and I still do this even now, it's kind of thinking about whether people want something a little bit more lighthearted or whether they want serious analysis. And obviously, working for a political news outlet like PoliticsHome, it's generally pretty serious. Like, we're not doing kind of entertainment news, celeb news, gossip kind of stuff. It's all policy and parliament. And generally our audience, that's what they want from us. But having said that, when we were on TikTok, it was a completely different audience to probably what the standard PoliticsHome audience is. So when we were first setting that up and experimenting with it, it was a lot more kind of meme content, and kind of trying to be a bit more funny. I think one of the videos that did really, really well was literally more of the kind of raising the curtain on what it's like to work in Westminster. And I think there was a video at Conservative Party conference when a protester interrupted Liz Truss's speech in 2022. And we just got a video of hundreds of journalists just running like full pelt to go and try and like intercept this protester. And I think we might have put a funny sound over it or something, but it went a bit viral and still gets likes today. I still get notifications on my phone even 2 years later. So I think it is just being quite open-minded to what your content could look like, and also having a bit of a distinction, I suppose, in terms of what the publication is putting out and what you're putting out as an individual. And to be honest, I feel like I change my personal content quite a lot. Like, some weeks it will just be purely professional. Sometimes I'll put a little bit more personality or opinion, but generally I keep it pretty professional in terms of just sharing my stories. But a lot of other journalists will do that very differently, and they'll have their social media very much as a kind of opinionated place where they put themselves into it a lot more. So I think it's quite subjective, really, and kind of depends on what you're comfortable with and how comfortable you are putting yourself out there, really.
Yeah, for sure. I think while researching you, like two threads that you made on X particularly stood out. I think it was the one about the origin of your middle name and your living experience in London just after moving here. So, for example, could you like just give us a little bit of context behind your middle name and why you use that story and turn it into a thread to start success?
Yeah, so that was a bit of a I just did that on a whim, really. I think it was the start of last year, 2023. And basically, like, I studied history at university. And I always knew that I had some family history of journalists and some people who had been in the Belgian resistance during the Second World War against the Nazis. But I had a little bit of time over that Christmas to just research some more of my family history. So it was a bit of a personal quest, really, to just find out more about it. And I just found out some very inspiring stories of my family going back a few generations, producing kind of underground reporting out of Brussels, and also being involved in rescue operations of like left-wing figures across Europe to escape Nazi persecution. So I kind of posted that thread as a bit of a personal thing, but kind of tied it into the end about the fact that actually I'm a political journalist now. And while it definitely wasn't my primary motivation, and I very much wasn't raised in a political family by people working in politics, I just found it quite interesting, almost generations after I'm now doing this job, similar to what my kind of great grandparents were doing 100 years ago. And maybe potential for a book in the future. So I was kind of testing the water for that to just see whether people found it interesting. Because while I don't have the time to do it right now, it would be really amazing to kind of write some kind of family history maybe in the future. And it's something that a lot of journalists do at some point in their career, is write a book. And if I was to write a book, maybe that would be something that I could potentially write about. And yeah, it was nice. Like, I got a few MPs getting in touch, kind of saying that they'd read it and found it really interesting. So yeah, that's kind of the story behind that, really.
Yeah. So like I think that's like a great example of like you showcasing an eye for a story. Like that was literally you be feeling interested in your family history. And then from that point onwards, you saw that there was a very interesting story behind this and then put it out to the world and to very, very, very well. So my question is, does that eye for a story just almost like come innately to a person? Like if you decide that you want to journal, it's just with you, or is it something that you can develop over time with experience?
I think it depends on the person. I think some people have maybe naturally more of an innate sense for it than others. I've always enjoyed, I don't know, I feel like I've always been the kind of person that, like, at a dinner party, I love like telling an anecdote. I think that's just part of my personality. But equally, I wouldn't actually say that I've got a really natural eye for the best line out of a story. I actually think that's something that I've had to work quite hard on, because I actually find everything interesting. So my problem is I just can go down in a rabbit hole and personally find something fascinating and talk for hours about it, but that's not necessarily going to be what everyone else finds interesting. So I kind of have had to learn what makes something snappy for a reader, what kind of just clicks with like the wider public, really. But that also depends on what audience you're speaking to. Like, if I'd done an Instagram story of that compared to doing a Twitter thread, like, it might have gone down very differently. So it's also about just like knowing the platform, knowing what your audience is. But I do think it is something you can learn. And I think it was actually, and probably still is, the number one question that I have when I go to editors is, okay, I've done this big interview. I've talked to them for an hour about all these really interesting things. I'm just struggling to figure out what the top line is. And I'll send like a few bullet points of what I think the top lines are. And usually the editors will agree. They don't always. But for me, I've definitely honed that skill, like, compared to a few years ago, where I think my idea of what a top line would probably be quite different to what I think now.
Yeah, for sure. And then earlier we spoke about your move from Nottingham to London. So there's obviously another great thread that you made about your housing nightmare, which I think is also like a great cautionary tale about moving to the big city just in general. So like tell me about that experience, and then what do you think makes a good piece of long form journalism on social media?
Yeah, so that was essentially a situation where, over a few years, in my flat in South London, we had a big problem with a leak coming through the ceiling. And it got so bad earlier this year that essentially every time it was raining really heavily, it would rain indoors. So it was just leaking all over our living room. It started leaking in one of my flatmates' bedrooms as well. And it was just really, really bad. And without going too much into the granular details of it, it was a situation where it was both a private landlord and agent involved, but also the council, which owned the building. So there was a lot of kind of people passing on responsibility for it without taking any accountability. And essentially, I posted a thread on X to expose what was happening, and essentially just kind of pull that lever to try and get them to act quicker. And guess what? It worked. As soon as the press starts to turn their attention to something like that, unfortunately, it does mean that a lot of landlords and councils will then act quicker to resolve it, which is very unfair. And to be honest, I really hated that I had to almost pull that lever of kind of being a political journalist and having an audience on social media to get that change, because obviously there's a lot of people, a lot of families who do not have access to that kind of power, which is something that I mentioned in the thread as well. But yeah, I think with that, the most important thing that I knew when I was drafting that thread was that I'd have to provide photos and videos to show how bad the damage was and really kind of highlight the personal human impact that it had on us as tenants. Because, you know, if you're just doing a long kind of dry written thread about a housing issue and you don't really have any like imagery to support it, it's probably not going to do as well. And you can see that in coverage online and on TV of any kind of housing issues in particular, that the evidence is key. So I think with that, it was very much just showing the extent of how bad it was. And yeah, obviously with a thread, it's very important to have a quite snappy intro as well. I think it was quite sensational, but I think I might have introed it as like my London housing horror story or something like that. But it grabbed people's attention, so it did the job.
I guess that's the point at the end of the day. So it works. Okay, so my next question is, so as new social media platforms arise, like you've been a big adopter of Blue Sky, like and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like you're the 11th most followed journalist on Blue Sky, which is you seem to wholeheartedly take in new social media platforms like that have the ability to help journalists. So what is your like approach to being that flexible?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I think maybe it goes back to just my fundamental personality being quite interested in everything. And maybe not always being very good at just focusing on one thing and putting everything into that. I kind of flit around a lot. But I think, I mean, with Blue Sky in particular, it was actually my former editor at PoliticsHome, Laura Silver, kind of got wind of it more than a year ago now and encouraged us to use it. And to be honest, my main motivation was just how awful I started to find Twitter since Elon Musk took it over. And taking any ideology aside, no matter what his political views or who he supports or anything like that, just the pure functionality of Twitter as a journalist started to be really degraded, because obviously I was doing PoliticsHome's social media and also sharing my personal stories on my own account. And I've just seen over the last 2 years how engagement has just plummeted across the board. And also just as a journalist, like you're using it as really your primary source of like daily information, particularly in politics, because that's where everyone's kind of sharing the daily updates. And I was having to sift through so much kind of bot content and quite disturbing content as well that wasn't relevant to what I want to write about before I would get to what I actually wanted to see. So I kind of embraced Blue Sky really as an alternative, because I felt like X had started to be not just unhelpful, but actually damaging towards how journalists both find information and share information. And yeah, I think just the fact that I was kind of an early adopter of it just really helped. And I think when you're starting any social media platform, it's trying to figure out what your USP is going to be. And because PoliticsHome has got that kind of Westminster insider feel, I figured out that probably one of the most helpful things that we could do was put together what's called a starter pack of basically all of the MPs who are on the platform so far. And that just really took off. So I was kind of updating that every day, adding in each politician as they joined it. And because people found that so helpful, it meant that they would follow me and they would follow PoliticsHome because they saw us as a useful source of information. And I think journalists have 2 or 3 like primary functions, and that's to hold power to account, find out information, but also just be helpful and be a source of like true and accurate information that the public can rely on. And obviously there's so many issues with misinformation and active disinformation on social media that I think is quite important that journalists have a duty to that and kind of verify the information that they see and try to be as upfront as possible about how they find that and just be helpful to the public in terms of where they can then find that information themselves.
Yeah, no, definitely. So now can I ask you about your current role as a junior political reporter that you started back in January of this year? So like moving into a different role, that mean a different department, like what's changed in your day to day?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty small team. So in terms of the editorial team, there aren't really different departments per se. So less moving departments, more just essentially, like in terms of when I was social media journalist, each day there would be some days where I'd be spending more time on social media than political reporting. Now it basically just means that generally all of my days I spend more time doing reporting than I do social media. But I do still run the social media content on PoliticsHome's pages, but I share that responsibility with another colleague. So we kind of, share that out. And it just means that rather than the way it works before, I wouldn't necessarily pitch things every day in meetings, compared to now, it's much more expected of me that I would have those fresh pitches every week. And less of the emphasis is on kind of our audience numbers or like how well our social media is doing. But ironically, with the whole blue sky shift, that did actually take up quite a lot of my time. So to be honest, it's still quite flexible, and sometimes I will spend more time doing social media stuff. But I think it was more just a change to reflect the fact that I was already doing a lot of political reporting and just kind of needed the job title change really to reflect that.
Yeah. And how is like having the opportunity to work from Western just in general and interview politicians, celebrity figures a lot, and just generally be in and amongst it?
Yeah, it's really, really exciting. And it's honestly something that I would have never imagined myself doing. Like I've always been interested in politics and I wanted to be a journalist for a very long time. But I did not think that my first full-time journalism role was going to be getting a lobby pass and working out of Parliament. So I feel incredibly lucky and privileged to be able to do that and to be able to meet so many interesting people, so many influential people every day. I think obviously it comes with its ups and downs. Like everyone knows that Parliament can be quite a pressurized work environment. I suppose there are elements of it that can be quite toxic at times. But I personally try to keep quite a set boundary and just ensure that I'm, for example, I try and have a rule with myself that I don't go to more than one after hours event in Parliament every week, because there's so many events going on all the time. You can end up just burning yourself out if you're going to the Parliament bar one night and then going to another event the next night. So I think you kind of have to learn your own boundaries with that. But I think ultimately the fact that I can just wander into Parliament and I can text an MP and meet them for coffee a few hours later and talk about whatever we want to talk about is amazing. And I think one of the main reasons I wanted to go into journalism was because I just really wanted a job where I was never going to be bored. And this job definitely satisfies that. I've definitely never been bored. So yeah, it's amazing. And I think also the fact that working at PoliticsHome, we have quite a lot of freedom over what we want to write about, which I really, really value. So it's not kind of dictated to us really what we write day by day. I can kind of decide to an extent the kind of themes that I want to focus on. And I've mostly done a lot of our social media policy coverage, tech policy as an extension of that. And I'm starting to do more healthcare policy as well. So yeah, kind of if you've got a beat that you're particularly interested in, you can kind of explore that as well, which is really nice.
And you also work on the podcast as well. Like I've been seeing like episodes coming out pretty recently. So tell me and the listeners a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so PoliticsHome has a weekly podcast called The Rundown, where we get guests, usually one or two MPs, some experts, authors, a whole range of people. And it usually just kind of tackles a theme each week. So for example, one we did recently was Britain and the world, so looking at UK foreign policy. I went on one a few weeks ago looking at the whole social media landscape of MPs leaving X and joining Blue Sky, as we just talked about. So essentially how it works, the host, Alan, will usually invite us as reporters to go on the podcast if it's a particular topic that we've been covering, which is obviously why I was invited to talk about the social media stuff. So yeah, I go on it once every few months, I'd say. And we will be having some Christmas episodes and New Year episodes going out over the festive season, which we always get involved with. I think we all had a glass of Baileys while we were recording it last year as well. So it's always just a bit of fun over Christmas. But yeah, it's really fun to do. And we usually record them in our office in Millbank Tower as well. So yeah.
And was like getting involved in podcasts as such like something that you'd done before, like recently, or was it something that you just always wanted to get into? And now you have the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I think when I was working in News Associates, I used to run quite a lot of workshops and host interviews like you're doing with me right now. Very similar. So I think that experience sets you up quite well for doing podcasts because it's that kind of conversational format. I never set out specifically to be a broadcast or an audio journalist, but I really enjoy doing it as a kind of supplement to my written work. So while I wouldn't necessarily want to be primarily a podcast journalist, I really enjoy the fact that I get to do that as an aside, especially because I get to go on and talk about specifically the topics that I'm most interested in. So yeah, I've done, and something else that a lot of political reporters in particular get to do is I will often go on radio stations to just give a little rundown of the day in politics, sometimes on TV as well. I went on BBC News at Lib Dem conference this year to just give a bit of a summary of what was going on at the conference. So it's all really good experience. I still get really, really nervous whenever I do broadcast, but that's just me. Other people don't get as nervous. And I think probably the more you do it, the more accustomed to it you get. And because I don't do it super, super regularly, like every week, I think it's just still a case of just getting used to it and kind of getting into the rhythm of it. But I do really enjoy it when I do it. So yeah, for me, it's definitely a kind of complementary aspect of my job at the moment.
Yeah. So I think this is a nice segue into the next section where I'd like to ask you a little bit about how you're able to keep a healthy work-life balance as a journalist, working in Parliament from Westminster, very much from the outside, it seems like it could be all-consuming. And I ask this question to basically everybody that comes on. So do you have any tips for trying to keep a healthy work-life balance?
I'd say it definitely helps to have people in your life who hold you accountable for having some personal time. I think if I didn't have people around me who were constantly saying, Zoe, like, stop looking at your emails, or right, we're going to have the whole of the weekend to just like spend some time just us and you're not going to look at work the whole time, I'd probably be a lot worse at keeping that balance if I didn't have that. So I think it's actually quite a good shout if you're starting a new job as a journalist to actually say to the people around you, please hold me accountable, make sure I'm switching off, because I think so many journalists are just very ambitious, workaholics, that you can fall into a pattern where you might not be doing like work and you could convince yourself that you're switching off. But actually you're still checking the news all the time, or you're looking at your WhatsApps on your phone to just check whether that MP's replied to you. So there's so many traps, I suppose, for journalists to fall into to not really allow yourself that off time. So yeah, I think the people around you is important, but also just trying to genuinely set boundaries. And I think it's easier when you have an office to go to. I personally would really struggle being freelance or working from home, because I find it really hard to create that boundary if the physical space I'm working in is the same as my personal space. So generally, I work in the office or in Parliament every day. I usually work from home on Fridays, but Fridays is usually a bit more chill. so I don't mind that so much. But for me, going in every day helps, because it just means that there's that separation. You close your laptop at the end of the workday, and then you go home and you can not think about it for the rest of the evening. And I think just making sure that you use your annual leave quite wisely. It's quite a logistical point, but I think just making sure that at least once a year, you just take like a good chunk of time off. Like, don't do it where you're just taking really bitty bits of time, where you don't fully have the time to really switch off your brain. Like, I think it's really valuable to have, at least 2 weeks if you can, just once a year, so that you can really rest, really take that time to just recharge and reboot. Because particularly this year when it was a general election, I knew a lot of journalists who didn't really have any annual leave for months and months. And I think that just leads to burnout. And obviously sometimes that can be easier said than done, but if you can, just make sure that you're scheduling in those breaks. We had the option over Christmas to kind of be on call for various bits of Christmas, and I just opted to just take off the whole period as annual leave, because I'd rather just completely switch off, go home, spend time with my family, than even in the back of my mind think, oh, if there's a breaking news story, I'm going to have to jump on that. So that's just personally how I approach it. But everyone will have different ways of coping with their workload. And obviously different journalism jobs will have very different shift patterns and what they look like. And I think it's important to consider when you're going for a job in journalism, what your priorities are, whether night shifts is something you can realistically do, or whether you really need that much more 9 to 5 kind of work-life balance. So I do think it's an important consideration to make.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like very much when you are coming straight out of university and you're navigating that first journalism role, like you very much are thinking, oh my days, I need to just put everything into this. And if I haven't sort of fun taken away from work and my career, and I think it's very, very good to just pause just for a second, just to recollect stuff, because burnout is it's very much a killer. Very much a killer. But yes, so thank you for so thank you for that answer as well. Because now I feel like we spoken about Zoe's career and how she got to the point where she's at right now for a good while. But now we are entering the not so fast and furious round. I like to say it's a fast and furious round, but it never really ends up being that quick. But we'll make it closer.
Word answers or
Like I reckon it's one of those ones where if you feel like you want to like allude, like add a little bit more that you think would be helpful, feel free to do so. But if you can make it short, then do so. So the first one is, are you an extrovert or an introvert?
both.
Both.
Okay.
Amber?
Yeah, that's the word, is it? Yeah.
Okay, nice. I see. Here's what I'm starting down. But literally yesterday, I was talking to my colleagues, and I was like, I feel like sometimes I'm quite extrovert or I'm a loud introvert. I don't know where I stand. I don't
No.
get it.
I'm the same. I think like I'm confident, and when I'm around people, I'm extroverted in a social setting. But sometimes in terms of my work and also my downtime, I'm actually quite introverted. Like, I'm happy to just sit in a corner and just plow on and not like make conversation all day. Like at uni, I would be that person who would choose the isolated booth to work in with like walls around me. But maybe that's just because I get distracted a lot. But yeah, I do like my alone time as well. I don't mind being alone. I don't mind my own company. So I think for me, it's a bit of a balance of both.
For sure. Are you a night owl or an early riser?
Night owl.
Yeah.
I respect it. Who would your dream interview be if you haven't interviewed them already?
Dream interview.
Yes, it's about one. It's about one.
That is hard. Well, I see, because I'm a history nerd, can I pick someone who's dead?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, well, even then, I've got the whole of history to work with, so that's pretty difficult. Well, obviously, like professionally, it would be really great to interview the Prime Minister. I haven't interviewed Keir Starmer yet, so it would be a really great opportunity to do that. And if it was like a historical person, oh, who would I want to interview? I mean, this is so nerdy, but I'd really like to interview like a 20th century prime minister like Harold Wilson or someone who was the Labour prime minister in the 60s, because I just think that was a moment of change. Or maybe Attlee, the Labour prime minister after the Second World War. I think that would be really cool. That would probably be one of my go-tos.
Okay. So, the fact that these figures have passed away kind of means that I'm going to have to quickly adapt my next question. But let's say in this imaginary world, you are closing this podcast and going to interview Clement Attlee or Harold Wilson. If this was in the case where this was going to happen, what sort of song would you put on to get yourself in the mindset? Or would you even listen to music? Would you put on a podcast? What would you do?
Ooh, I'm really bad at listening to music for work because I've got quite like a musical brain. So my brain will just attach to the music and I won't be able to think about anything else. But I do play piano, so I'd probably put on some like calming piano classical music because it would just get me into the zone. And that's also less likely to like give me a bit of an earworm. I don't know, if I put on like Espresso by Sabrina Carpenter, I'd just be like humming it during the interview or something. So I can't be doing that. You sort of probably put on like a bit of Chopin, Raindrop Prelude. Again, that's so nerdy, making me sound much more nerdy than I am, but that's my honest answer.
Okay, nice. The thing is, like, you could have lied on that question, but I much prefer when people are honest with it. Because, like, I'd say something probably crazy, but like, obviously, I'm not being asked. So, but next question is, okay, so following up on the music sort of bias, what is the best concert you have been to?
Best concert I've ever been to. I was a massive Arctic Monkeys fan when I was a teenager, and I still really like their music. So genuinely the most like excited and like happy I've ever been was, I think, when I saw Arctic Monkeys a couple of times when I was like 16, 17. I saw them at Leeds Fest, I think, in 2014. So definitely in terms of like how happy I was in that moment, yeah, I think it's got to be that.
I respect it. Arctic Monkeys are good. They're very good. Okay, so let's say as well back to Clement Attlee and Harold Wilson. So let's say if you had to make them your specialty when it comes to cooking wise, what would you cook up in the kitchen?
I make a mean vegan chili.
Okay.
And also I feel like that would be a bit of a novelty for like mid 20th century UK. So I'd introduce them to a bit of spice, some vegan mincemeat. I don't want to make of that. I try to convert them to the vegan cause for sure.
You know what? I think they might appreciate it, to be fair. It seems like pretty cool figures. So last few questions are, what are you currently watching TV show wise?
I've been binging Love is Blind recently.
Oh, okay.
So that's like, yeah, I was ill. I had a cold a couple of weeks ago. So I spent a couple of days in bed and I just started binge watching the American first few seasons of Love is Blind. And that's really deep. I don't think anyone who hasn't watched it, like, it's not like Love Island where it's just quite shallow conversation and just like based on looks and stuff. They get really into like relationship problems.
Yeah. Okay.
Live an interesting human experiment. But I'm really looking forward to the new season of Traitors. We're definitely going to be watching that when it's out because I'd love the of that.
Like, if I'm being honest as well, everybody that asks that question, like, I actually do end up watching the show that they put out. So I'll give them a vote. I'll give them a vote.
Do Traitors first. I wouldn't like recommend Love is Blind as like a really good show. It's just very binge worthy. But Traitors is
okay. Traitors? Okay, nice. I'll start with that. And then favorite holiday destination?
I went to Peru on my own in 2018, and that was definitely like the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Just like the mountains, the Andes. So yeah, I'd have to say Peru.
That is pretty cool. That is pretty cool. Did you pick up Spanish in that period of time?
I didn't know any Spanish, and I was doing some like volunteering when I was there with people who didn't know English. So I had to pick up some very, very quickly.
It was a sink or swim situation. And then
Absolutely.
favorite movie, and then I have a final question for you.
Favorite movie? That's so hard.
It is difficult, but I'll say I put the pressure on. First thing that comes up in your mind.
I can't, because the thing is with these favorite questions, a bit like Arctic Monkeys, like the ones that come to my mind are the ones that I was just obsessed with when I was a kid, and I was a huge Harry Potter fan, which is just the most cliched like millennial answer ever. But I had a Christmas meal with some friends last night, and we were talking about where would your like favorite place be to spend Christmas? I was just like,
Yes.
you know what, unashamedly, it would be Hogwarts. Like, who wouldn't want to spend Christmas in like a castles with like a fire and like magic happening? So yeah, that would just be amazing. But actually, I'm actually reading Crime and Punishment at the moment for the first
Oh,
time.
okay.
And if I was answering my favorite book, I'm actually saying it's gonna be up there. It's really, really good.
Okay, nice. And my final question, and it's crazy that you answered what's a favorite book as well, because that was basically the next one I was going to ask. So that is actually good, because my final question is one word to describe your career as of right now.
Exciting.
Okay, exciting. And with that, thank you very much, Zoe, for coming onto the podcast. And thank you everyone for tuning into the How to Be a Journalist. I've been Plamini Mabungu, and thanks for signing it.